She walked into the ruined dunes alone, until the sand started screaming beneath her feet. The desert stretched endlessly before her, an ocean of burning gold that rippled under the merciless afternoon sun. Heat rose from the dunes in visible waves, distorting the horizon into liquid mirages that promised water where none existed. The air itself seemed to shimmer and burn, each breath like inhaling flame, each exhale carrying away precious moisture her body could barely afford to lose. The woman moved slowly through this scorched landscape, each step sinking into sand that burned even through the worn soles of her boots, the heat seeping upward through leather that had once been thick and protective, but now felt thin as paper against the desert's fury. Her name had been forgotten somewhere in the weeks behind her, lost like footprints in a windstorm, erased by the same relentless forces that smoothed the dunes and scoured the stones. Now she was simply the traveler, the survivor, the one who kept moving when stopping meant death. Identity had become a luxury she couldn't afford, a weight she had shed along with everything else that wasn't essential to the simple act of continuing to exist. Names belonged to the world before, to cities with walls and wells, to places where people gathered and spoke and remembered. Out here, in the vast emptiness where even shadows sought shade, she was just another small creature struggling against entropy and heat, no different from the scorpions that burrowed deep, or the lizards that moved only in the brief cool of dawn and dusk. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had grown leaner with each passing day, fabric that had once fit snugly now draping in folds that spoke of weight lost, and muscles hardened by constant exertion. Dust caked every fold of fabric, turning what had once been dark canvas into the same pale brown as the desert itself, as if the landscape was slowly claiming her, transforming her into just another element of the endless waste. A torn scarf wrapped her face against the wind, the fabric so saturated with dust and salt from her own sweat that it felt stiff against her skin, leaving only her eyes visible, 2 points of determination in a mask of survival. Those eyes scanned the landscape with practiced wariness, reading the dunes like someone else might read a book, interpreting the subtle shifts in color and texture that spoke of solid ground versus treacherous softness, of stable surfaces versus sinkholes that could swallow a person whole. She knew this desert now, knew its moods and its malice, knew the difference between the stillness before a sandstorm and the stillness of ordinary afternoon heat, knew that it killed the careless and the unlucky with equal indifference, made no distinction between the foolish and the wise when its full fury was unleashed. Her pack contained the accumulated wisdom of her survival, items she had gathered, discarded, regretted losing, and learned to live without. The knife at her belt had been with her from the beginning, a gift from someone whose face she could barely remember now, though she recalled the weight of it being pressed into her hand and the words spoken. Something about staying safe, about coming back. She had done neither. The rope coiled in her pack had saved her twice. Once when she fell into a ravine and managed to anchor herself to an outcropping, hauling her bleeding body back to the surface through sheer stubbornness, and once when she needed to lower herself into a well so deep that the splash of the dropped stone took 3 full seconds to echo back. The journal she no longer wrote in had been full of observations once, notes about the desert and her journey and her thoughts, but somewhere around the second week, the act of recording had begun to feel like creating evidence for a future that might never arrive, documentation for a coroner who would never find the body. Behind her stretched a trail of disturbed sand already beginning to smooth in the light wind, the desert erasing evidence of her passage with the methodical efficiency of a system that had been perfecting the art of erasure for millions of years. Ahead rose the ruins she had spotted from the last high dune, ancient stone structures half swallowed by centuries of sand, their upper portions still proud despite the desert's patient assault. They jutted from the desert floor like broken teeth, remnants of some civilization that had thrived here before the earth turned hostile, before whatever change in climate or fortune had transformed this place from somewhere people could live to somewhere people could only die. She had learned to seek out such places, for they sometimes offered shelter from the sun's fury, sometimes held trapped moisture in their shadowed crevices, where morning dew condensed on ancient stone, and occasionally contained forgotten supplies from other travelers who had passed this way, leaving behind the things they couldn't carry or didn't survive to retrieve. The ruins drew closer with agonizing slowness, that peculiar desert effect where distance became unreliable and judgment became treacherous. Distance in the desert was a liar, landmarks appearing near that were hours away, promising respite that retreated like the mirages, making fools of those who trusted their eyes over their experience. She had learned this lesson through bitter experience, had once pursued what looked like a close outcropping for 3 hours before reaching it, arriving so exhausted and dehydrated that she collapsed in its shadow and didn't wake until the cool of evening saved her from the mistake. But these structures were real. She could tell from the way they held their shape as she approached, from the actual shadows they cast. Shadows with sharp edges unlike the fuzzy boundaries of heat mirages. Solid stone that existed in 3 dimensions rather than 2, and she pushed toward them with renewed focus, the promise of shade and rest pulling her forward when her body wanted nothing more than to sink into the sand and surrender to the heat. Her water supply had dwindled to perhaps 2 swallows remaining in the battered canteen at her hip. Maybe 3 if she was very careful and very lucky. The metal container grew lighter with each day, a countdown to the moment when her lips would press against empty steel and find nothing, when the last drop would be gone and the real test of her survival would begin. She had been thirsty before, had experienced the cracked lips and thick tongue and pounding headache that came with mild dehydration, but she had never crossed the line into genuine water crisis, had never faced the reality of the body beginning to shut down systems and conserve resources and make the hard calculations about which organs were essential and which could be sacrificed. That line was approaching now, visible on the horizon like the ruins themselves, getting closer with each hour that passed without finding a source. She had survived worse, or so she told herself, though the memory of those survivals offered cold comfort. 3 weeks ago, or was it 4? Time blurred in the sameness of days. She had weathered a sandstorm that scoured the skin from her hands and face, leaving her half buried and disoriented when the wind finally died. She had dug herself out with hands that bled from the abrasion, had coughed sand from her lungs for 2 days afterward, had picked grit from her eyes and nose and ears for a week. The storm had taken her spare water bottle, ripped it from her pack, and flung it into the desert somewhere, along with one of her protein bars and the hat she had been wearing. 2 weeks before that, she had fallen into a hidden pit, an ancient cistern that had saved her life with its damp walls and collection of rainwater so old it tasted of stone and time and minerals she couldn't identify. She had drunk that water anyway, had filled her bottles and her belly despite the strange flavor, and it had sustained her even though her gut cramped for a day afterward. The desert taught harsh lessons, but she had proven herself a dedicated student, had learned to read its signs and respect its power, and never, ever underestimate what it could do to an unprepared traveler. The ground began to change as she approached the ruins, a transition she noted with the attention of someone who had learned to notice such things. The soft, shifting sand gave way to harder packed earth, compressed by the weight of the structures above and the traffic of countless feet over countless years, feet that had walked these approaches when the city was alive and thriving. Fragments of worked stone lay scattered like puzzle pieces from some incomprehensible design, blocks carved with precision and fitted with skill that spoke of engineering knowledge and architectural ambition. She saw the remains of what might have been a road, straight lines of fitted blocks barely visible beneath the sand's encroachment, like the skeleton of something long dead, showing through the skin of the desert. Whoever had built this place had possessed knowledge and resources, had created something meant to endure through ages, had believed in a future that would remember their works. The desert had buried their achievement anyway, patient and inevitable as entropy itself, proving that all human ambitions eventually returned to dust, and that stone was only temporarily more permanent than flesh. The first structure rose before her, a tower of crumbling brick and stone that leaned at a precarious angle, defying gravity through some combination of engineering genius and sheer stubborn refusal to fall. An archway gaped at its base, offering entrance to darkness that promised coolness, shade, escape from the hammer of the sun that had been beating on her for hours. She paused at the threshold, because the desert had also taught her caution, had taught her that rushing into darkness could be as fatal as standing too long in sun. Dark places held their own dangers, their own threats that waited in shadow for the unwary. She had encountered scorpions the size of her hand, their stingers capable of delivering venom that would paralyze a person while they were eaten alive. She had seen snakes that struck faster than thought, fangs folding down from the roof of their mouths to inject poison that stopped hearts or destroyed tissue. And once, deep in another set of ruins, she had encountered something else entirely, something that had made sounds in the darkness that convinced her to spend the night outside despite the cold. Sounds that suggested intelligence and malice and hunger, all combined in something that should not exist, but did. But the heat was murderous, and her water was nearly gone. She ducked through the archway into blessed shadow. The temperature dropped immediately, the thick stone walls holding back the worst of the desert's fury. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, revealing a circular chamber with walls covered in faded carvings. Symbols she couldn't read told stories she couldn't understand, but the artistry was undeniable, even in its weathered state. People had lived here, loved here, died here, and left their marks for no one to remember. She unslung the pack from her shoulders, feeling the immediate relief as the weight left her back. The pack contained everything she owned: a knife with a blade she kept sharp through nightly ritual, a length of rope that had saved her life twice, a small metal cup, a fire-starting kit in a waterproof pouch, 2 protein bars so stale they might break teeth, and a journal she no longer wrote in because the act of recording her suffering seemed pointless when no one would ever read the words. The canteen came free from her hip. She allowed herself one small sip, just enough to wet her throat and remind her body that water existed. The taste was warm and metallic, but it was life, and she rationed it with the discipline of someone who understood consequences. Tomorrow, she would need to find more. The ruins might offer a cistern or a well, some ancient water source that still held moisture in its depths. She would search in the morning when she had strength. For now, she needed rest. The chamber seemed secure, defensible, a good place to wait out the worst heat of the day. She settled against the wall, positioning herself where she could see the entrance, and let her body relax for the first time in hours. The stone felt cool against her back through the thin fabric of her shirt. Dust motes drifted in the shaft of light falling through the archway, golden particles suspended in stillness. That was when she heard it, a sound like nothing she had encountered before in the desert, not the hiss of sand blown by wind, not the skitter of scorpion legs on stone, not the whisper of snake scales on rock. This was different. This was a vibration that came through the ground itself, a low frequency that she felt more than heard, as if the earth was groaning in its sleep. She went perfectly still, every muscle tensed, every sense alert. The sound came again, longer this time, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost like speech, like some massive throat attempting to form words in a language of stone and sand. It came from below, from somewhere beneath the ruins, from the hidden spaces that extended down into darkness beneath the desert floor. Her hand found the knife at her belt, drawing the blade free in a motion made smooth by repetition. The steel gleamed in the dim light, 7 inches of carbon that had cut rope and food, and once, when she had no choice, living flesh that had meant her harm. She hoped she wouldn't need it now, but hope was a luxury in the desert, less useful than water and only slightly more common. The groaning sound faded, replaced by a silence that felt thick with waiting. She remained frozen, barely breathing, listening with an intensity that made her head ache. Minutes passed. Nothing moved in the shadows. The shaft of sunlight crept slowly across the floor as the sun traveled its arc. She began to think she had imagined it, that dehydration and exhaustion had conjured sounds from nothing. Then the sand screamed. It was the only word that fit, though no human throat could have produced such a noise. It erupted from everywhere at once, a shriek of rage or pain or warning that vibrated through the stone walls and set her teeth on edge. The chamber itself seemed to shudder, small fragments of brick breaking loose from the ceiling to clatter on the floor. The sound went on and on, rising to a pitch that made her ears ring, filling the space with such violence that she pressed her hands over her ears and opened her mouth to equalize the pressure. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt like a wound in the air. She was on her feet without conscious decision, pack already on her shoulders, canteen secured, knife held ready. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to put distance between herself and whatever had made that sound. But the archway that had seemed like salvation now appeared as a trap, a single exit that might lead her straight into danger. She forced herself to think, to assess, to plan. The sound had come from below. That meant something beneath the ruins, something in the network of chambers and tunnels that ancient builders had carved into bedrock. She had seen hints of such spaces in other ruins, stairs leading down into darkness, passages sealed with collapsed stone, grates covering shafts that dropped into nothing. This structure almost certainly had similar features, access points to whatever lay beneath. She needed to know what she was dealing with. Blind flight might run her straight into danger. Better to investigate, to understand the threat, to find out if she could avoid it, or if she would need to fight. The decision made, she moved toward the far side of the chamber, where deeper shadows suggested another passage. The opening was there, half hidden behind a collapsed section of wall, a doorway that led to stairs. Stone steps worn smooth by countless feet over countless years, descending into darkness that her eyes couldn't penetrate. The screaming sound came again, briefer this time, echoing up from the depths with a fury that made her hesitate. But she had no choice. The desert outside offered no escape, just empty kilometers of sand that would kill her as surely as anything below. At least in the ruins she might find answers, might discover what made the sand scream and how to avoid it. Information was survival. Ignorance was death. She descended carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved for feet smaller than hers, and the darkness grew thicker with each meter down. She had a small flashlight in her pack, powered by a crank generator that gave maybe 10 minutes of weak light for every 100 turns. She cranked it now, the ratcheting sound unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, then flicked the switch. The beam illuminated roughly 3 meters of stairway, enough to show her the next dozen steps, and the walls pressing close on either side. The stone here was different from above, darker and more finely cut, with none of the weathering that marked the upper structure. These passages had been sealed from the desert air, preserved in their underground silence for however long the ruins had stood empty. The stairs ended at a landing that branched into 3 corridors. She chose the middle path arbitrarily, following it as it sloped gradually deeper. The air grew cooler and carried a scent of minerals and ancient dust. Her breathing sounded harsh in the confined space, echoing back to her from somewhere ahead. The corridor opened into a chamber much larger than the one above. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing columns that rose to support a ceiling lost in shadow overhead. Between the columns stood structures she recognized as tombs, stone sarcophagi arranged in neat rows, each carved with symbols and faces of the dead within. This had been a burial chamber, a place to honor those who had passed from the world above. She moved between the tombs carefully, reading what she could of the carvings. These people had been wealthy to afford such memorials, important in whatever society had flourished here. The faces carved in stone showed both men and women, some young, some ancient, all rendered with a skill that captured something essential about their living selves. She found herself wondering who they had been, what they had hoped for, what they had feared. The wondering saved her life. She was looking at a carving of a woman holding a child when the floor erupted 20 feet behind her. Stone and sand exploded upward in a geyser of debris, and something emerged from below with speed that defied its size. She had an impression of segments, of pale flesh that had never seen sunlight, of mandibles the size of her torso clicking together with enough force to crack bone. The creature was massive, easily 30 feet long, its body composed of repeated segments, each equipped with dozens of legs that found purchase on stone and tomb alike. It was some kind of worm, though that word felt inadequate for something so large and predatory, like calling an avalanche a pebble or an ocean a puddle. Desert legends spoke of sand dragons, of things that swam through earth like water, that pulled entire caravans under the dunes, leaving nothing but disturbed sand and the scattered belongings of travelers who had simply vanished. She had dismissed such stories as myth, as the fearful imagination of people trying to explain disappearances that had more mundane causes like dehydration or getting lost or plain bad luck. She had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the evidence of her error rose before her, with mandibles spread, and that circular mouth gaping to reveal rings upon rings of backward curved teeth, designed to grip prey and pull it into a throat that looked deep enough to swallow her whole. The creature's eyeless head swung in her direction with horrible certainty, mandibles spreading wider to reveal the full extent of that nightmare mouth. It had no need for eyes in the eternal darkness of the deep desert where it had evolved or adapted, or simply existed for however long such things had lived beneath the sand. But it could sense her somehow, could feel the vibration of her heartbeat through the stone floor, or the warmth of her body against the cool air of the tomb, or the displacement of air as she breathed. Whatever sense it used was effective, precise, unerring in its focus on her position in the darkness. She was prey now, reduced to the simplest biological category, and every instinct in her body screamed the same message. Run, run, run now, or die here in the darkness with no one to know what happened and no one to remember you existed. She ran, and the decision saved her life. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as she sprinted between the tombs, throwing crazy shadows across the walls that seemed to multiply the creature pursuing her, creating the illusion of many predators when one was more than enough. Behind her came a sound, like stones grinding together as the creature pursued, its many legs finding holds on columns and sarcophagi and the carved faces of the dead, pulling its massive bulk forward with horrible efficiency that should have been impossible for something that size. It was fast, faster than something 30 feet long had any right to be, and it was gaining, closing the distance between them with each second that passed. She could hear the clicking of its mandibles now, close enough that the sound made her skin crawl, close enough that she imagined she could feel the displaced air as those massive jaws snapped at her heels. The tombs blurred past on either side, ancient monuments to forgotten people becoming nothing but obstacles in a deadly chase through darkness. Her lungs burned with exertion, and her legs screamed protest, but she pushed harder, knowing that stopping or even slowing meant death, meant being caught by something that had probably killed hundreds or thousands of others in its long existence beneath the desert. The floor was uneven, scattered with debris, and the remains of collapsed structures, and she leaped or dodged or simply ran through obstacles, trusting speed and luck over careful navigation. She saw another corridor ahead, a narrow opening between two tomb structures. The creature would have to slow down to fit through such a space, might not be able to follow at all. She pushed every remaining energy into reaching that gap, legs burning with effort, lungs screaming for air. She made it through with inches to spare, the mandibles snapping shut on empty air behind her. The creature crashed against the tombs, the impact shaking dust from the ceiling. She kept running, following the corridor as it twisted and turned, not daring to look back, waiting for the sensation of teeth closing on her body. The passage branched and branched again. She chose turns at random, caring only about distance and direction, about getting away from the nightmare behind her. The creature's pursuit sounds faded, replaced by the thunder of her own heartbeat and the rasp of her breathing. She ran until her legs simply stopped working, until she collapsed against a wall and slid down to sit with her head between her knees, trying not to vomit. Minutes passed. Nothing came. The corridor remained empty in the weak glow of her flashlight. She had escaped, though whether through speed or the creature's disinterest she couldn't say. Perhaps it had been territorial, driving her away from its hunting ground rather than pursuing prey. Perhaps it had other food sources in the deep places of the ruin. Perhaps she had simply gotten lucky. The flashlight flickered and died, the spring wound mechanism exhausted. She cranked it again mechanically, needing the light like she needed air. The beam returned, showing her a passage that continued ahead into more darkness. Behind lay the way she had come, back toward the burial chamber and the creature that had emerged from below it. Neither option seemed appealing. She forced herself to stand. Sitting in the dark would accomplish nothing. She needed to find another way up to the surface, needed to escape these underground passages and return to the familiar danger of the desert above. At least there she could see threats coming. At least there she could run in a straight line. The passage continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Time was difficult to judge in the unchanging darkness. Eventually, it opened into another chamber, this one smaller than the burial hall, but still substantial. The flashlight revealed walls covered in more carvings, these depicting scenes rather than individuals. She saw images of the city above as it must have been when people lived there, buildings intact and streets bustling with carved crowds. She saw irrigation systems bringing water from some distant source, gardens growing in the desert's heart. She saw prosperity and life, and she saw the worms. They were in the later carvings, arriving after the city had been established. The ancient artists had rendered them in profile, showing their segmented bodies and terrible mouths, showing them pulling people beneath the sand, showing entire buildings collapsing as the creatures tunneled below. This city hadn't been abandoned willingly. It had been destroyed, its people killed or driven away by the things that lived in the deep earth beneath the desert. The creatures had been here for centuries, probably longer. They had claimed these ruins as their territory, their hunting ground, their domain, and she had walked into it alone. The carving also showed something else, something that gave her a fragment of hope. In the final images, the survivors were shown leaving through a specific gate, one that opened to the west. If the same gate still existed, if she could find it, she might have a way out that didn't require returning through the burial chamber where the creature waited. She studied the carvings until she had memorized the route, tracing the path with her finger on the stone. The western gate was accessed through a tunnel that ran from the north side of the city, meaning she needed to go up and then lateral to find the surface and navigate by the structures above. More stairs appeared at the far end of the chamber, these ascending steeply. She climbed them with renewed purpose, counting the steps to distract herself from the burning in her legs and the lightheaded sensation that came from exertion without adequate food or water. At step 217, she emerged into another corridor. At step 308, she found herself looking up at a shaft that rose vertically, with metal rungs set into the stone providing a ladder to the surface. The climb took everything she had left. Each rung was an individual battle, a moment of choosing to continue when her body wanted to quit. Halfway up, she had to stop and rest, hanging from the rungs while her arms shook and her vision swam with exhaustion. The flashlight was dying again, its beam fading to orange, then red, then nothing. She cranked it one-handed while gripping the rung with white-knuckled determination, the mechanical ratcheting sound echoing up and down the shaft. When her hand finally closed on the edge of the opening above and pulled herself up into sunlight, the relief was so intense, it felt like a drug. She lay on warm stone for several minutes, just breathing, just feeling the sun on her face, just being grateful to be alive. The sun had moved significantly since she had entered the ruins. Late afternoon now, the light golden and the heat beginning to ease toward the cooler temperatures of evening. She was on the north side of the city, just as the carvings had indicated, surrounded by broken walls and collapsed buildings that gave some orientation. The western gate should be visible from here. She stood, swaying slightly, and scanned the ruins. There, in the distance, she could see a gap in the city's outer wall, a break in the stone that might have once been a formal entrance. It was perhaps half a kilometer away, an easy walk under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances, with her water gone and her body running on nothing but will, it seemed like a mountain to climb, but she had no choice. The alternative was to stay in these ruins, to risk another encounter with the creatures below, to die slowly of thirst while surrounded by ancient stone. She adjusted her pack, checked that her knife was secure, and began walking. The ruins were eerily silent in the afternoon light. No birds called, no insects hummed, no wind stirred the dust, just her footsteps crunching on sand and stone, just her breathing harsh and quick. The structures around her cast long shadows now, creating pools of darkness that she avoided instinctively. She had seen what lived in the darkness here. Halfway to the gate, she heard the sound again, the screaming sand, that horrible vibration that came from everywhere and nowhere. It was behind her this time, back near the structure she had exited from. Something was pursuing, tracking her somehow across the ruins. She quickened her pace, not quite running but moving faster than was sustainable, driven by fear that overrode exhaustion. The gate drew closer with agonizing slowness. She could see details now, could make out the carved columns that flanked the opening, could see that the gate itself had long since rotted or been removed. Just an archway in the wall, but it represented escape, represented freedom from this place of death and nightmare. The sand ahead of her exploded. The creature that emerged was smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. Its segmented body coiled as it rose, putting its blind head level with her chest, mandibles clicking in anticipation. She could smell it now, a scent of earth and ancient decay, of a predator that had fed on countless victims over countless years. She didn't think, because thinking took time she didn't have, and would have led to paralysis through fear. The knife was in her hand, and moving before conscious thought could interfere, driven by instinct and terror, and the simple refusal to die here without fighting, without making this thing work for its meal, without leaving marks on it that would remind it that humans were not easy prey. The blade struck somewhere near where a conventional animal might have eyes, though this thing had none, just smooth, pale flesh that had never known sunlight. Dark fluid spurted from the wound, thick and viscous, and smelling of earth and ancient things, and the creature's scream was the same sound that had filled the chamber earlier, that same rage and pain given voice through whatever mechanism let it produce that horrifying sound. It struck at her like a snake, mandibles closing on the space where she had been a moment before, jaws snapping shut with enough force that she heard them crack together, heard the grinding of whatever served it for teeth. She was already moving, already rolling to the side with a grace born of desperation, coming up with the knife ready for another strike, blade held low and angled up the way she had been taught by someone whose name she couldn't remember, but whose lessons had stayed with her. The creature followed her movement, its body capable of coiling with surprising speed and precision despite its bulk, demonstrating an agility that seemed impossible, but was undeniably real. They faced each other in the shadow of the ruins, predator and prey, though which had become unclear in the space of a few heartbeats. The creature had size and natural weapons, and the home advantage of knowing this terrain intimately, of having hunted here for years or decades or centuries. Or she had intelligence and desperation, and 7 inches of sharp steel that had cut rope and food, and once, when she had no choice, living flesh that had meant her harm. A story she didn't let herself remember too often. The equation balanced in some strange way, creating a moment of terrible tension where each waited for the other to commit, where the next move would determine who lived and who died in this forgotten place beneath the desert. The creature lunged with shocking speed, its entire front section rising from the coil as mandibles spread impossibly wide. She dove forward, not away but toward it, under the strike, a move that felt insane but was the only option that made sense. She felt mandibles close on air above her, felt the wind of their passage and the heat of the creature's breath or exhalation or whatever it expelled from that nightmare mouth. The knife found the creature's underside, that pale flesh that had never known sun, softer than the armored segments of its back, and she dragged the blade along its length as momentum carried her forward, putting her weight and desperation into the cut, opening a wound that ran for 3 feet or more before she rolled clear and came up ready for the creature's response. The thing's scream shook dust from the nearby walls and brought small fragments of ceiling raining down around them. It coiled on itself in what might have been agony or fury or some combination of both, mandibles snapping at its own wound in confusion or pain. Dark fluid pumped from the injury, more than she had expected, pooling on the stone floor and giving the air a metallic smell that reminded her of blood, but wasn't quite the same, was something older and stranger than anything that flowed in human veins. She didn't wait to see. She ran for the gate with everything left in her, burst through the archway into the open desert beyond, and kept running until the ruins were small behind her, and her lungs burned like fire, and her legs finally refused to take another step. When she fell, it was onto clean sand that held no hidden creatures, sand that was just sand. She lay there gasping, bleeding from a dozen small cuts she didn't remember receiving, covered in the dark fluid that served the creature for blood, but alive, against all probability, against every reasonable expectation, alive. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and red and purple. The ruins stood black against the colorful sky, a monument to death and loss, and the things that waited in darkness. She watched until full night fell, and stars emerged overhead, more stars than seemed possible, a river of light across the black vault of heaven. She would need to move soon, to find shelter against the cold that came when the sun disappeared. She would need to search for water tomorrow, to somehow continue surviving in a landscape that wanted her dead. But for this moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel her heartbeat gradually slowing, to exist in the space between breaths, where nothing was required but being alive. The desert stretched away in all directions, endless and indifferent, but she had beaten it for one more day. She had faced the darkness beneath the sand and emerged into light. She had walked into the ruined dunes alone, and though the sand had screamed beneath her feet, though monsters had emerged from the deep earth to claim her, she had survived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tomorrow was still hours away, and she had learned not to borrow trouble from the future when the present demanded all her attention. For now, under the infinite stars, she was alive, and that was enough. She thought of the carvings in the chamber, those images of the city in its glory, of people who had built something beautiful in the desert's heart, and watched it fall to the predators below. They had known what lived beneath the sand. They had carved warnings for those who came after, had left a record of their struggle and defeat. She wondered if anyone would carve her story, if anyone would remember the woman who walked into the ruins and fought her way out again. Probably not. The desert kept few records. It erased footprints and scattered bones, and buried everything eventually in its patient march of sand and time. But that was acceptable. She didn't need monuments or memories. She only needed the next sunrise, the next day of survival, the next chance to prove that she could endure in a world that had become hostile to human life. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had guided travelers and merchants and warriors through this desert in ages past. She used them to orient herself, to plan tomorrow's route away from the ruins and toward the uncertain hope of water and shelter. The night would be cold, but she had survived worse. Everything was survivable until the moment it wasn't, and she had no intention of reaching that moment anytime soon. Sleep came eventually, though she remained half alert, even in unconsciousness, ready to wake at any sound that suggested danger. Dreams came too, confused images of darkness and teeth, and the sensation of falling through sand into depths where no light had ever reached. She woke several times, each time needing a moment to remember where she was, to separate dream from reality. Dawn arrived with its usual drama, the sun cresting the horizon like an explosion of gold and rose. She was already moving, body stiff and aching but functional, mind clear with the simple focus that came from having a purpose. West, away from the ruins. West, where the caravan routes had once run when this desert was less hostile. West, where memory suggested there might be an oasis that still held water. The ruins receded behind her, swallowed gradually by distance and heat haze. She didn't look back. Looking back accomplished nothing. Only forward mattered. Only the next step and the step after that. The endless accumulation of small survivals that added up to staying alive. Her water was completely gone now, the canteen dry and useless at her hip. Dehydration would become critical within 24 hours. She needed to find water today, needed to discover some source that could keep her alive long enough to find the next source, and the next, in the endless chain of necessity that defined life in the desert. But she had survived the screaming sand. She had walked into ruins that had swallowed countless others, and emerged back into sunlight. If she could survive that, she could survive anything the desert threw at her. The thought gave her strength, carried her forward across the burning kilometers, kept her moving when body and mind both wanted to quit. The desert was vast and cruel, and utterly indifferent to her continued existence, but she was stubborn and skilled and unwilling to surrender to the dust. Somewhere ahead lay water, somewhere ahead lay shelter, somewhere ahead lay another day of survival. And another after that, each one a small victory against the forces of entropy and death. She walked into the burning morning, alone but undefeated, and the desert watched her pass with its eternal patience. It could afford to wait. Time was on its side, but she had learned to steal moments from time, to carve out survival from circumstances that should have killed her. As long as she could take the next step, as long as she could draw the next breath, she would continue. Behind her, beneath the ruined dunes, the creatures stirred in their darkness and screamed their ancient rage. But she was gone, beyond their reach, moving toward an uncertain future that was nevertheless brighter than the certain death that waited in the buried places. The sand might scream, but she would not answer. She had her own voice, her own will, her own stubborn insistence on survival. And in the end, that was enough. If you want more stories from the desert, from the edge of survival where every decision matters and every dawn is a gift, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. This woman's journey continues in the endless wastes, where the sand hides secrets both ancient and terrible, where ruins hold mysteries written in stone and blood, where the line between life and death is measured in drops of water and moments of courage. Tell me in the comments what moment of her journey shocked you the most, what decision you would have made differently, what you would do if the sand beneath your feet started screaming and you realized you were standing above something that had waited in darkness for centuries to feed again.